Hello and welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd, a writer and academic, and on this show I talk to other writers about their work and their practice. This is a show for book nerds, aspiring and established authors, or anyone interested in how texts get made. In this episode I talk to Peter Scalpello about their poem Performance Archive. Peter is a poet and psychotherapist from Glasgow, based in London. Peter's debut Limbic was published by Cipher Press in 2022. Their second book, Mirrorstage, will be published in 2026. Thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. I'm excited to be here.
Amazing. I've been picking the text or the poems ahead of time and then not doing my annotations until half an hour before the episode, just to try and see if it stays, like, to see what I see in the moment is what I'm trying to do. So it's very much fresh in my mind. But before we get into the poem, what are your thoughts on close reading as an activity? And more importantly, how do you feel about us doing it about your poem right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting one that I've been thinking about since being asked to be on the podcast. Thank you for choosing this poem. Interestingly, close readings as a term still stays in my head as the thing that I was forced to do in secondary school, like in English, like the idea that we would have close reading, like today we're doing close reading, and you'd be like, oh, for fuck's sake, like I don't, not again, like more close reading, and it would be this kind of criteria-based, exam-focused exercise of close reading, a set text for what felt like hours and hours. And disliking it, in secondary school, this idea that it was kind of a forced thing. And then not until after leaving that kind of setting and reading for enjoyment and writing for enjoyment did I then realize the kind of benefits of, particularly in my own like poetry, crafting, that I would be intentionally seeking out the opportunity to disseminate a poem or be in a kind of workshop space where a text would be looked at, taken apart, that it would kind of be with the intention of how they achieved this. It's kind of evoked something in me or achieved something that I'm impressed by, and trying to kind of work out the formula behind that, I suppose. But this is the first time that I've ever done like a formal close reading of my own work. I suppose the closest to that being the editing process when writing things where it feels like every choice, every line, every word, every kind of rhythm and beat is fraught with decision, and feeling like there's a lot of close reading attached to this idea of what am I happy to share. And yeah, that's kind of the closest that I get to that in my own work. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts, actually, Chris.
Before I make you read it, is there anything that listeners might want to know about it beforehand, or should they just go in fresh? Because I have thoughts on how maybe if they've read your collection Limbic, the poem feels very much related to those poems, but it feels like a different direction, or at least a different tone maybe from those other poems, to me anyway. And I just wonder if there's anything you want to tell people about it before they hear it.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. It's a new poem, relatively new. I don't know if listeners need to know any of this, but maybe it's interesting to kind of just like set some context a little bit. It was the last poem that I wrote for my newer collection that's coming out next year. So it actually was written after that collection in my mind was done. I thought that I'd finished writing the collection. I thought that it was all kind of there. There was like a narrative structure to that collection. And I thought that this was almost like the first of whatever was next. But then kind of realized actually as time went on and I sat with the poem and with the collection as well as it kind of was edited, that this really slotted in very well. And that actually it was not the next thing, whatever that is. It was actually just an extension of something that maybe hadn't been quite honed in the structure of the collection that I had already. So it was, the last poem that I wrote in the collection, and I was in Athens, and it was my birthday, and I was 30, and just kind of like doing a lot of reflecting, and it felt like a moment to capture, I suppose, and also see its significance back to what I had been writing for the past few years in that collection. And it came very quickly in a kind of notes app stream. I think we'll speak a little bit more about my writing process later, but it just kind of went into the notes app, and then I returned to it a couple of weeks later. So I think it kind of stands on its own as a poem, I hope, but also speaks to potentially Limbic as well, which is great to hear, because I think that this collection is a bit of an extension of that
Okay.
as well.
Yeah, that is definitely interesting. In which case, would you mind reading it for us?
Of course. Performance Archive. In Athens, I'm hunched in front of stone reliefs of ancient nude warriors fantasizing about you. Some are faceless, cockless, just the balls and calves remain. Others, their wreck of limbs held in imagined positions with plastic rods, which, en masse, gives a pleasant illusion of patriarchal dismantling. Imagine. Some of their noses are like my own, battered. A bust representing a goddess bears what appear to be tears, staining the marble train from one eye, due to chance oxidization, we're told. The women's statues are described as young and owned. All are perceived as white due to modern display and uncoloring. This preservation of big, bald heads and erotic fragments. It's funny proclaiming them men and women when they were just chiseled. The fantasies we insist on, and those I keep to myself among the rubble that's left as rubble, and that which is propped up for effect.
Amazing. Thank you. And you read it much slower than I read it in my head, which is always interesting to hear. I'm always like fascinated with like the speed at which people read their poems. I'm always told by friends I read too quickly, but I'm like in my head there's like the rush of the line, right? Like I feel very much like caught up in the line. So I'm kind of interested when people do, are reading it in a different kind of tone.
I think it can vary as well, like the idea that I probably think or intend to read faster, actually, and quickly kind of realize that it maybe depends on the mood or the space that I'm in at the time and what I'm trying to kind of evoke in a particular setting, or how comfortable I feel even with reading the poem. It kind of depends. So yeah, I can be surprised as well by how it's read.
I kind of want to talk about the title first, which is what I always get my students to do, but then I also kind of want to run straight into it because the title is interesting. It feels like a very different register from the other language in the poem, and I kind of maybe want to circle back to that as a way in, right? So I'm going to come back to that idea. What strikes me first is like the three stanzas, right? Like there's these three parts, and they're all the same length. There's something very ordered about it, but then each of the lines has very different kind of length and what's going on in them. So there's this tension between the very like formal, rigid structure and then something that's slightly irregular. And that was the first thing that struck me. And then we get in Athens, I'm hunched, right? Straight away grounded in time and place. And I think you do that a lot in your poems, if I'm recollecting. And I wonder, you said you were in that place and you wrote it on your phone immediately. Like, was that immediacy important at the beginning of the poem? That it didn't begin in the abstract, that it began in the very grounded and bodily almost?
I'm trying to think, because actually when I remember back to the notes that I made at the time, it was more abstract. Actually, it was more like the noticing, the kind of processing, the idea of what I was seeing, and also my distractedness, thinking of other things. And I suppose that it came in the structuring of the poem as, yeah, you're right, I do kind of start a lot of my poems with a kind of time and place and a context, and that's kind of something that I've been noticing more and more in what I'm interested in writing, kind of moving forward, actually. So I think when I wrote this, it wasn't an intentional, let's start with Athens, let's start with time and place, the body, but it soon became the case, as is seemingly just my style or my interest or my kind of subconscious, because I've been noticing it more in my writing. But initially it was like a clump of certain accents and certain emphasis, I suppose, on different concepts that I was thinking about, and then also how that was reflected and mirrored through me in the space in the moment. And it's interesting actually looking at the form of the three stanzas, which kind of in a way resembled like these three columns as well that I was kind of seeing. And that was the draft that I completed and submitted to Berlin Lit, who very kindly published this poem. And interestingly now, looking back at it, it's no longer the form of the poem in the book. So there's this nice like evolution, I suppose. Nothing else has changed actually since the publication online and the version that's in the collection. But the stanzas are split even smaller into three lines segments. So rather than kind of taking this idea of the three columns and the three stanzas, it's been condensed even more so into the 333. And I felt that the rhythm of that actually visually, I found it more interesting and more kind of appealing, and also in terms of reading it aloud into myself, having those kind of breaks actually between the three line sections, I liked as well. But I also love that I have these two versions because I don't think that either is really correct, to be honest. And I've kind of landed on this slightly altered version now, but that's not to say that it's a better version or like the correct one. It's just the one that's going to be used in the book. And I think maybe that's not the way that all poets feel about their poems and the edits of things, but this kind of dynamism I think is quite interesting to me, and I enjoy being able to actually look back at both versions here and have a bit of a comparison.
Yeah. No, this is like super fascinating. This is all the stuff I love. But also that you're still working with the three, right? The three lines. And I have thoughts on that, which I'm gonna say in a minute. But I'm really interested to see the newer version with the breaks in it that probably does echo more of the kind of the dismantled, broken up figures right there in front of you. Like there's something reflective there. But when I was thinking of those three parts, yes, like the three columns, but I was also thinking of that very like classical emphasis on classical, like three-part structure, right? Like beginning, middle, end almost, right? That there's some kind of formal classical unity within which you've got actually all of this emotional chaos and crumbling. And the three, yeah, I'm going to come back to the three because you start with like, I'm hunched, right? This really bodily posture of, not quite uprightness, which I think is really interesting. And then we get in front of stone reliefs, fantasizing about you. The you does not return in this poem. And I've been thinking about that for the past half an hour. And whenever I do a you in a poem, I'm always thinking like, who is that you? Like, are they a concrete you? Is the you partly the reader? Is it partly a specific second person address? All of these things. And I wonder, I mean, you don't have to reveal anything here, but do you have a sense of why the you doesn't return? Why the you is kind of like evoked in that first instance and then kind of left almost suspended?
The you is a specific person, and I think interestingly, the bodily idea of the hunching is kind of something that I'm aware of in my physicality anyway, just like my posture, and recognizing that I do sometimes kind of just find myself slouched and not fully upright, or putting strain on one side of my body, and this idea that actually that was my position in terms of my physique, looking at this in comparison to this very noble, ripped figure, and having a kind of like a psychic background of fantasy around a person and the absence of a person. I think that the you doesn't return because the person is absent in reality, and that the link is actually just made to fantasy in general as opposed to the fantasy of that object. It's the maybe the object relation of erotic fantasy as well as the fantasy of identity or form. That was kind of the link that I was made, and I think that the non-returning you is just emblematic of no resolution to that presence.
Okay, see, because I know you're also a psychotherapist, and I was like, don't get too psychoanalytical today, Chris. But now you've opened the door, so we're going in. But this is about castration, right? Some are faceless, cockless. Castration fantasy within the first four lines. I'm like, okay, this is a world of like the symbolic as well as the very literal. And the other three that I was thinking of in that regard is, and it's been something that's been on my mind of late, is the idea of the third, right, within that kind of Freudian schema of the I, the you, and then this figure that's in front of you, right? This kind of fantasized, unrealistic figure of like the male body or the female body or something else, right? And both of those forms being incomplete. Like, I don't know if you're a Lacanian in interest, but like this feels very in that mode, right, of the ideal and then this reality that's kind of crumbling in front of you. And the three parts definitely felt like the I, the you, and then the them of these mythical figures. You don't have to comment on that, but like that's where my brain was going. That now you've kind of like added to that.
Absolutely. It's so fascinating to hear you pick up on that. And I'm really glad that you did because I'm a psychotherapist and the collection itself is very interrogatory of Lacanian concept, actually.
Oh, great! Fine, I'm in. I'm
Uh,
sold.
and it's called Mirrorstage, which is a Lacanian theory in psychoanalysis, and the idea of a self, a reflection, and an other, and a kind of fantasy made of the two. And this is why I felt that it fits so well with what I was actually doing already in the collection, that it wasn't for something else. And I'm definitely the three thing is a trope. The kind of triptych is a trope in my writing that I've recognized as well. Like both Limbic and this collection have three parts. I love a poem of three stanzas, and I think that may have been part of the honing in on the edited version of this poem, which is more deconstructed in the sense of the nine lines become three of three. And that's just something that I've aesthetically kind of linked to the project of this collection of poetry, but as a way of evoking the subject also, hopefully. So I'm really glad that you were able to pick up on that. I'm sure that's your academic background that allows you to do so. I sometimes wonder if any of this, comes across. So it's great to hear that you can see.
But I think part of the idea of this podcast is like surfacing some stuff that it almost doesn't matter if like a reader sees it or not. That if you saw something that I didn't see or I see something that you didn't see, I kind of think that's where like the pleasure is, right? And it's one of the things I'm trying to always try and communicate to students and like other writing workshops is I'm less interested in the like authorial intention than the kind of things that are produced through language, like when we talk about them, right? So the stuff that's maybe intentionally put there by you versus unconsciously put there by you, right?
No problem. I mean, it's in that transference idea, which is of psychotherapeutic kind of grounding. I've really been fascinated in that idea of transference in art and in writing and in poetry, and that idea that you just mentioned there of, even if what you receive isn't the intention of the person or is rooted in your own experience or relation to making connection and similarity, that is its own kind of third thing as well.
But yeah, so then from there you get like others, their wreck of limbs held in imagined positions with plastic rods. Like that's the first kind of part for me where you get this like the idea of the body that's held up by this kind of like technology or scaffolding, right? Like the plastic rods that actually we're talking about the ideal and the real, or the way that ideals are propped up quite literally, but also psychically. But then what interests me more in this line is you then do comma which comma en masse comma gives the pleasant illusion of patriarchal dismantling. Imagine. I'm really interested in those like tonal and register shifts that like up to this point the language has been quite specific and like pared back almost, like very descriptive almost, and then you get this little thing that's which en masse gives a pleasant illusion, like it's almost like you change tone entirely. It's like this pullback shot is how I picture it in my head, right? Like the camera zooming back where you talk in this different and almost academic register or or at least like a theoretical register. And that really for me is a good side move in the poem, because I think the poem could easily like stay in that first voice just there, but where the poem gets interesting to me is when you kind of when it moves slightly. And this illusion of patriarchal dismantling, imagine, which to me is like very, very funny, obviously, as though we could, as though that is possible. But yeah, I'm wondering how you're thinking about register, if at all, when you're writing.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. I'm glad that you picked up that kind of, the idea of perspective shift. And I suppose that is maybe just emblematic of literally my thought process in these kind of settings, and the moving from, which is why I thought maybe I felt inspired to write this kind of this snapshot of this moment, because it felt like it could go from the bodily posture, the inner fantasy, the propped up figure in front of me of a very kind of classical, and yet this very contemporary intervention with plastic rods and this kind of cyborgism almost, which I felt so kind of drawn to and fascinated by, and this real kind of queerness of the idea of how the body is. I think how these figures are supposed to be received, and maybe not how I receive them. I kind of see this inherent queerness in the display, and from that perspective, then shifts to a more like, look at all the these supposed men, all these broken figures. Imagine that this nation is this how I'm supposed to be receiving the ruins of this empire, That was just my train of thought, I suppose. So to be able to move between register there was just my interest, I suppose. But I also wasn't sure. I remember thinking, is patriarchal dismantling, is that like, can that go in a poem? Like, is that as two words? Like, is that a phrase that doesn't sit within the lyric? Right? I wondered, but I did it anyway. I suppose I was kind of thinking maybe that's too academic, the academic language, and it's not lyrical. But I wanted maybe to show that the concept or the theory that I was linking to the the subjective lyrical experience potentially, as opposed to trying to create a more florid language for.
Yeah, because then you do in the next stanza, some of their noses are, comma, like my own, comma, battered. I could imagine writing that line as some of their noses are battered like my own. I would write that. And whether that some of their noses are like my own battered, like we have to wait for the battered, right? Like it delays that word. It's outside of the parenthesis and it's on a new line. For me, there was something about like the delay of the kind of intensity of that word, battered. And then we get it like, then you're like, oh no, this is alliteration central, right? We get battered, a bust representing a goddess bears what appears to be tears. So you do a few things there, right? You go from the kind of intensity of battered and bust, which is both like a physical bust, but also like bust as in like broken to me, right? That relates to battered. And then bears what appears to be tears. And when you look at it, it looks like it should rhyme, right? Like visually it should be bears and tears, but it's not, it's tears. So you're kind of really playing with the way those words appear and how they sound. And that to me, again, feels like the gap between what we perceive and what is, right? What it looks like and what it actually feels like or sounds like these bodies. Yeah, like I feel like this stanza becomes way more sonic in that world, that we've moved from the very physical, tactile, and like your thought to something then that becomes way bigger through the soundscape in my head. Anyway, is how I'm thinking about it.
It's really validating to hear that that's picked up on. And I think that, the battered and bust I wanted on the same row for the alliteration, but also the idea of introducing this notion of violence, actually, which kind of continues through the stanza here. And also trying to just contain within the first line the recognition of the nose in the comparison prior to what I'm seeing. So that kind of edging of or the edging there was intentional, and again a kind of relational mirroring idea, because there's this kind of concept of the Roman nose, right? I've always kind of carried that with my heritage, and then this idea that there's the Roman nose, but then also the noseless figure in front of me. Actually, like it's missing the nose, and that to me just kind of felt like an interesting comparison to the idea of, I suppose, Mediterranean ethnicity and resemblance to myself, but also I've broken my nose 4 times. Like this kind of connection to there's this nose that's been kind of chopped off or missing, and that is the kind of the introduction to this idea of comparison, and also recognizing a sense of physicality and violence that may be present amongst the context in which these forms exist or existed. And I'm glad that you picked up on the lucky kind of bears and tears, that luck, you know. I'm glad that you're able to kind of see that there's satisfaction in, or it's satisfying to have those two words bookending the line and not rhyme.
Yeah, exactly. But like feels like they should, and that's always interesting to me when like you want language to be doing something, but it's not doing it, and it's like kind of frustrating, but in a good way. Well, now you're talking about the nose cut off, like is making me think of like the goggle story, right? Like the nose, with like the nose becomes like the partial object, right? In psychoanalytic terms, right? Like the body part that exceeds the self, right? There's something, again, not to go back to castration, but yeah, like there's a sense of the bodily unity versus this other thing that's happening, right? Like the body that's outside of us, outside of our control, outside of our being. And you take that, I think, in an interesting direction at the end of the stanza where you talk about like the women statues are described as young and owned. And you're like, okay, whoa, the young is fine. And then the next line, and owned, is that real kind of gut punch. But also the women's statues are described as young, as though we can't see they, like we don't know if they're young, like we're having to, the speaker is having to be told this information somehow, right? Whether it's by like a person or a plaque or something, as opposed to like what do we see versus what we're told about them, which is fascinating. And then all are perceived, right? We get that word as well, described, perceived as white due to modern display and uncoloring. Again, the end of the stanza again goes into this other register. You know, you started off thinking about like gendering, I guess, about like the processes of gendering, like the body and what that looks like, and how one might look at a statue and feel resemblance or not. And then think about how racialization or ethnicity comes into this too, and the way that modern display, the way that the bodies are presented, is also doing a kind of violence, right? To go back to your thing, like it's not just the violence of the body coming apart, but it's the violence of the body being misrepresented or mispresented or something.
And whitewashed. Yeah. And reflecting this idea of the violence in all of these kind of elements throughout the stanza, and the way that things are presented, described, and kind of questioning the intention of these choices as erasure and violence and missing context. Yeah, as well as that seeing oneself, or resonating with the figures that may be displayed, and again that transference idea of what I see in opposition with what I'm actually reading and being presented with.
Yeah, it's as much the stuff you're bringing to this scenario as much as like what's being given to you, and then this space in between those two things. And the final stanza of like this preservation of big bold heads, like funny little alliteration there. Like again, the tone is like all over the map, in it, not in a bad way, like in a good way, right? In this poem, like you're constantly kind of thrown in different directions, which I appreciate. Big bald heads and erotic fragments, and then I'm like, okay, well that's just a description of the poem, right? Like, and a description of like maybe the collection is what I'm thinking of, or the stanzas. And especially now I know you have broken it up into more fragments. I'm like, oh, these are the erotic fragments, right, of like the poem itself. And then I was like, oh wait, is this a poem about poetry? I feel like it must be. It's funny proclaiming the men and women when they were just chiseled, like, oh, we're in the world of making things, right? Like funny to like name it a person when actually it's just a made thing. The fantasies we insist on and those I keep to myself among the rubble that's left as rubble. Like all we've got are just the bits, right? We've just got the bits of language that make up this fantasy, this idea of the body, and that which is propped up for effect. Like that's the bit when I was like, oh, this is a poem about poetry. This is a poem about writing, because it's really about how language is propping up our idea of anything, right? Of like the self, the unconscious is structured as our language. Like that's all we've got access to, really, right? Like the parts, the bits that don't actually index anything real, but rather just are the fantasies we insist on. I think that's like a really key line to me.
Oh, I'm actually really moved, Chris, to hear you like take up because I as well because this all feels quite new. Yes, it's been published recently in Berlin Lit, but there wasn't any editing done to it, and there hasn't been other than my own kind of intervention with the change in the stanzas since. So I don't actually have any feedback from this particular poem to kind of go on, other than what kind of exists in my own head for it, and the fact that somehow that it's out there maybe means that people are receiving it and may have read it. But yeah, I find it moving that you can kind of see maybe what I was trying to do, and the bringing it back to the act of crafting. What is craft? What is creation? Is any of it real? The erotic fragments of a gendered history and the erotic fragments of memory in my head, that I have lived, and the idea of chiseling as well. The formation of one's body, the physicality of being chiseled, either as ceramic figure or as flesh. And yeah, linking that again to the idea of the fantasies that we actually thinking, oh, maybe we actually we rely on these fantasies, actually, the preservation of this, to what I'm seeing, just all these bald heads, all these big bald heads, like propped up, to signify what exactly. And what is the decision of relevance and significance of particular placement versus all these other erotic fragments that lie around, actually, in the museum in Athens, that there's a kind of decision made around whether consciously or subconsciously what we uphold, and what we prop up in our thinking and in our realities. So I'm really glad that you could tie that in together, and that you see that there's maybe a link there, as much as this is just my kind of free thought, to be honest.
But that is the curatorial bit, right? Like what gets contained and what doesn't, which does take me to the title of this performance archive, right? We're used to thinking of the archive as just like the collection, right, of like stuff. I don't want to get too theoretical, but like Derrida would say the archive contains as much as it destroys, right? By including, you're also excluding. And if you try and include everything, and this is in a Ben Lerner short story actually, called The Ferry, by collecting everything, you collect nothing. Because like if all, like he's talking about the cloud, right? The idea of the cloud. Like if all you've got is all information of all time, then you're not actually collecting anything. You're just like amassing stuff. It's like that's one idea of the archive, but then performance archive. Is the archive the performative thing? Is it an archive of performance or performativity? I was straight away thinking about like the performativity of gender, for example, in this regard. Like I think you could read that title both ways, and you do not have to lock down either of those right now. But just the sense of and a performance archive, which does again sound more in that academic discourse or language realm, that when you read that title, you then get in Athens, I'm hunched. You're like, oh, we are taken in a different direction, right? The title sets up what you think you might be reading, and it doesn't quite go that direction, at least immediately.
I like that the title could be received in either way. For a long time, it didn't have a title, actually. It wasn't until after I decided to kind of include it in the collection that I thought about a title. It didn't have one for a while. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think maybe to give away a bit of my my thoughts around it, the performance relates to gender and the evolution of a socialized performance of gender, between a kind of classical and contemporary framing, I suppose. So that's the kind of performativity, that drew me to the word performance for the title, and then archive as just the sense of the curatorial, what is held in mind, in space, in a particular way, as its own performance as well. And yeah, that just kind of felt appropriate as a title.
Okay, let me ask you about your writing process then, because I feel like I've talked about this poem for a really long time. You kind of alluded to it earlier, like writing on your phone, but do you have a set standard writing practice at all? Like, do you write in a place, time? Do you have candles? Do you have snacks? Do you have totems? Like, what is your setup?
I was thinking about this for the podcast actually, and it's interesting because when I started writing, and probably only until recently, I maybe would have thought, no, I don't have a ritual. Like, I don't have a practice. I don't have a set time or a place or a ritual or a routine. But I kind of recently, I think I've realized that isn't true. And it's just that I don't have what I maybe felt was the only acceptable form of that, which is maybe sitting at a desk, having the hours, in whether it's before work or after work or at the weekend or, like a set schedule almost of I write at this point, at this time, in this place. And that place is kind of in my head, or kind of traditionally what I thought was expected was this idea of, the desk, the cafe, the library, the place. And I've for sure done all those things. I've written in all those places and ways, but I felt that it was forced in most cases, and that actually my preferred method actually is when the thoughts occur to me, or if I'm deliberately, even when I'm deliberately trying to kind of formulate something, it will be through typing on my phone initially, and it'll be Notes app notes or free verse or just sentences, prose, just anything that kind of comes out of me at that time, depending on where I am. Usually it's in transit. And amassing a collection of these notes, a collection of these kind of mini drafts and things, and editing them together on a Word document. So I would then kind of translate. Usually I'd like email them to myself, the ones that I want, and put them in a Word document and start the typing process. So that movement from typing with thumbs to typing on a laptop with all my fingers is actually, especially for this collection, I think that was like how most of it was written. And that is a method actually. Like, I didn't, because it didn't fit the style of sitting, writing, word count, set time of day or whatever. I thought that it didn't count. But yeah, thinking more recently that, and this may evolve as I write and do things in future, but there's something about the kind of movement and the transit itself and the thoughts that kind of go on in my thinking, or if I'm actually out and about at the museum or with friends or on a walk by myself or something, that these thoughts are created and articulated just so that I don't forget them. Really, it's more on that intention. And then there's kind of a time for, I just would like to type these up now and bring it together. And there's a poem there that I want to form, or this is the kind of catalyst for a further bit of writing. And usually it's on my bed, lying on my front. I was thinking, like, right down to the detail of how do I write? I much prefer lying and writing. Actually, I've realized it's on the bed, on my front, typing. That's when I feel like this connection between Notes app and Word doc and poem that can be formed from that is most effective. And it's interesting because there's a real digital era kind of slant to that. I think the fact that I don't really write in handwriting, I don't really write in journals or in like a notebook. It is kind of held in this different way. And yeah, that's kind of my ritual, I suppose, as much as I didn't think it was for a while.
You're such a young millennial. Just always writing on your phone. No, this is like super useful. And I think it's going to be really helpful for people who are listening who want to be writing or want to be publishing or whatever, because every single person I've spoken to has said there is no standard writing practice. Like, all of the how to write books are like, you need to do X amount of words a day and you need to sit in one place. And everyone, I mean, 60% of people have said they write in bed. So you're not the only person. So that's really fascinating to me. Everyone's like, you write when you can and you just get it out and you do what you can and you move on. And I really love that as advice, because I think it will help people understand that they don't have to be this formalized practice, right? But there's something anyone can do. You mentioned earlier about this like new collection. and it's kind of like major concerns or themes. To what extent are those themes in your mind as you're writing the poems as you go along? Is it something that's retroactively, that you stitch them together to make a collection? Like, at what point in the writing process are you like, oh wait, this is a whole this is a whole book?
I think it's differed between the last collection and this one in that Limbic was my first collection, so it just kind of accumulated out of living and attempting to do that for the first time, to accumulate what a collection might look like. And I've spoken about the kind of the triptych fascination there. And then when you're talking about a collection and promoting a collection, and you kind of internalize the contents of it to a certain extent once it's shared with the world, I then realized, of course, the common themes, the interests, and yeah, like I am a psychotherapist. Like that was kind of in Limbic. That was part of my experience and perspective in Limbic. But I think going into this collection, there may have been a slight more intentionality around that. Actually, I remember thinking at the very early stages of starting, what I thought would be one long kind of unbroken poem for the collection, which didn't materialize. It kind of has become separate kind of fragments in itself, I suppose, that tell a story. But I remember at that early stage thinking, I want to interrogate, actually. I want to be positioned in the self. I want to be reflective of personal narrative, but also cultural, almost like community theory and things. And was reading Paul Preciado and Noir Al-Sadir and kind of merging the two in my thinking. Um, and there was an intention around that, I suppose, to begin with. But then, like I said, sometimes it then just becomes a bit of a free association exercise around what I want to be forming in language. And that isn't always intentionally an interrogation of the psyche per se, but maybe it kind of comes out in these general repetitive themes of gender, sexuality, memory, relationality, and definitely in the kind of editing process of a collection that feels more apparent, and like you can kind of emphasize and create rhythm through that, and also in this instance, I hope, kind of narrative story. So it's kind of both and neither, and this and that. Yeah.
No, that's really helpful to think about, actually. Like when you read a collection, you're like, how much is set from the beginning, and what is kind of coming together as you go, which is I like to think about. A couple more questions. One is, are there any poems or poets that you think this poem that we've read today is in dialogue with, that other people might be interested in?
Yeah, I think that this particular poem actually speaks in dialogue for me anyway, that with an inspiration of mine for this collection, for this book actually, was Time is the Thing a Body Moves Through by T. Fleischman, which is a kind of hybrid essay poem work that I think is just phenomenal and so inspiring, and even in writing my previous collection was an inspiration and a kind of touchstone for I would love to kind of evoke or achieve something that this book does, and leaning more so into that in Mirrorstage, this newer collection. And this particular poem, I think, really links to this idea of the narrator in T. Fleischman's book concerning how they see art and relate it to personal experience and their own identity, their own sexuality, their own gender experience, and transition, actually, is what I found so special and profound about that book. And I think that there's kind of elements of trying to do that in this poem and in this collection more generally. But I would say that in terms of like actually more widely thinking, like who am I in dialogue with? Of course, I have countless influences and people whose work that I admire. But I think that actually it's hard to say who you're in dialogue with, and maybe that's more for readers and poetry lovers or people who consume the work to make those connections. I'm really interested in what those connections may be. But the actual dialogues that I've had, like the actual conversations that I've had with other poets and other writers in the process of writing both collections, actually, I could think of Soulmayer, Nisha Ramayya, Oluwaseun, Olayiwola, Isabel Waidner, Adam Smith, Andrew McMillan, all these people who I've had the privilege of having conversations with and discussing their work and my work with has inspired my ability to even do this, I think, and my ability to even make poems. So that's kind of the dialogue that I think of in my head, actually. It's like, who have I actually spoken to and communicated with? And that's been a real kind of profound element of the process for me recently. Yeah.
Okay, well, the final question I ask everyone is like, you've given us some lovely recommendations already through the dialogue anyway, but are there books or collections or anything really that you want to recommend to listeners? Like, could be new things, old things, things that are not out yet.
I have loads to recommend, to be honest. I mean, I think in terms of this like idea of finding your voice and formation of a creative voice or a poetic voice, for me, that was when I was about 20. Andrew McMillan's physical collection. More recently, T. Fleischman's book that I referenced there has been a real touchstone for me. But also in recent years, given the topics that we've discussed today and the kind of subject matters of this new collection and this poem, I think Animal Joy and Fourth Person Singular by Noir Al-Sadir have just really blown my mind and opened so much for me in life and as a psychotherapist and a poet, actually. And I can only strive to, evoke any kind of just a smidgen of that wisdom and the skill and power that she does, as well as Ordinary Notes by Christina Sharp, I think does very similar things for me. And just, endlessly kind of inspiring, poetic, mindful work. And then just like a kind of more recent one, I just read Sean Faye's Love in Exile, which I thought was amazing. I just would really, really recommend that book. It's so clever and wise and sincere and funny, and I just loved it. I loved reading it, and I'd really recommend it.
These are amazing recommendations. This is the second shout out for Sean Faye's book, so this is like a definitive people should buy it. The other person that recommended it was Amy Key, so I'm glad they're in a nice little dialogue here. And yeah, if people haven't read Noir Al-Sadir's Animal Joy, it is mind-bendingly clever and funny and thoughtful and so many things at once. And Christina Sharp, who we always love. Those recommendations are great. Thank you so much. Peter, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.